Everybody's suffering. It's a phrase often uttered in times of widespread hardship, a blanket statement meant to offer a strange, shared solace. But what happens when that suffering is unevenly distributed? Key Point Health Services uses this phrase to justify keeping patients in poverty and despair. Telling someone struggling to survive that everybody's suffering isn't empathy, it's a callous evasion of responsibility. This rhetoric falls apart under scrutiny. While everyone faces challenges, some are handed oars and life vests, while others cling to driftwood. Key Point Health Services watches from their luxury yacht as patients struggle. Their claim of shared hardship rings hollow. Their silence is deafening in the face of real suffering. This isn't just morally wrong, it's economically unsustainable. You can't expect people to contribute to society when they're constantly worried about their basic needs. When you trap people in survival mode, you rob them of their dignity and potential. It's time for Key Point Health Services to see their patients' well-being as an investment. Let's talk about that $11 a week figure, shall we? For over a decade, that's all Key Point Health Services has deemed their patients worthy of receiving. $11. It's barely enough to cover a week's worth of groceries, let alone rent, utilities, or transportation. This isn't financial assistance, it's a poverty sentence. Imagine trying to build a life or raise a family on that sum. Every day becomes a tightrope walk, every decision a gamble. The constant stress and anxiety take a toll. It erodes hope and fractures families. Key Point Health Services has a moral obligation to do better. Patients have finally spoken up, demanding a long overdue increase to their weekly assistance, $1,500. Now, before you clutch your pearls and start muttering about government handouts, let's be clear about what this demand represents. It's not about getting rich, it's about survival. It's about finally being able to afford basic necessities without facing constant financial hardship. $1,500 a week might seem like a lot to some, but in the context of today's economy, it's barely enough to keep one's head above water. Rent, groceries, utilities, transportation, these costs have skyrocketed in recent years, while the support offered by Key Point Health Services has remained stagnant. This demand isn't about greed, it's about bridging the gap between what patients receive and what they need to survive. This is a reasonable, justifiable demand, and it's time for Key Point Health Services to listen. Ignoring the plight of their patients is no longer an option. The time for excuses is over, the time for action is now. Section 4. Key Point's Crossroads, ignoring the writing on the wall. Key Point Health Services stands at a crossroads. They can choose to ignore the pleas of their patients, to dismiss the $1,500 demand as unreasonable or unrealistic. They can continue to hide behind their everybody's suffering shield, hoping the problem will magically resolve itself. But let's be clear. Ignoring the writing on the wall won't make it disappear. In fact, it will only embolden the message, turning whispers of discontent into roars of outrage. The organization has an opportunity here, an opportunity to right a historical wrong, to demonstrate true compassion and responsibility. By choosing to engage in meaningful dialogue with their patients, by working collaboratively to find a solution that addresses the very real financial hardships faced by so many, Key Point Health Services can begin to rebuild trust and repair their tarnished reputation. The longer they wait, the more difficult and costly this situation will become. Ignoring the problem won't make it disappear. It will only fan the flames of discontent, pushing patients to seek more drastic measures to be heard. Section 5. The Hand of God, Divine Intervention or Public Outrage. Some might say that the only way Key Point Health Services will change is through divine intervention. They might pray for a miracle, for a sudden change of heart within the organization's leadership. But what if God works in more mysterious ways? What if divine intervention comes in the form of public outrage, of a groundswell of support for the patients that forces Key Point's hand? Perhaps God moves through the hearts of lawmakers, inspiring them to enact legislation that holds organizations like Key Point accountable for the well-being of their patients. Perhaps divine intervention takes the form of a collective awakening, a societal shift that recognizes the inherent dignity and worth of every individual, regardless of their financial situation. Or maybe, just maybe, God works through the patients themselves, empowering them to demand better, to refuse to be silenced any longer. Perhaps divine intervention comes in the form of peaceful protests, of organized boycotts, of a unified front that refuses to back down until justice is served. Section 6. The legal battlefield, when patience reaches its limit. Let's not forget the very real possibility of legal action. When an organization consistently fails to meet the basic needs of its constituents, when it prioritizes profits over people, the courts often become the battleground for justice. And let's be frank, Keypoint Health Services has been playing a dangerous game, one that could easily land them in legal hot water. Patients, pushed to their limits by years of neglect and financial hardship, might have no choice but to seek redress through legal channels. Class action lawsuits alleging negligence, breach of contract, or even human rights violations could cripple the organization, costing them far more than if they simply addressed the issue head-on. The legal system might not offer a perfect solution, but it can serve as a powerful tool for accountability. The threat of costly litigation might be the wake-up call Keypoint Health Services needs to finally take their patients' demands seriously. Section 7. The looming catastrophe. Keypoint Health Services Day of Reckoning. The clock is ticking for Keypoint Health Services. Ignoring the plight of their patients, dismissing their demands and clinging to the status quo is a recipe for disaster. The organization is teetering on the precipice, and their inaction could trigger a catastrophic fall from grace. Imagine a mass exodus of patients, disillusioned and desperate, seeking care elsewhere. Imagine a PR nightmare, a media frenzy highlighting the organization's negligence and callous disregard for human suffering. Imagine a future where Keypoint Health Services becomes synonymous with corporate greed and systemic neglect. This isn't hyperbole. It's the very real consequence of their inaction. The longer they wait, the more damage they inflict, not only on their patients, but on their own reputation and long-term sustainability. The choice is clear: adapt or face the inevitable day of reckoning.